A big welcome to today's guest, Kate Anderson. Kate is the Chief of Staff of Motherly, which is a well-known publication for parents and specifically mothers in the US. They also released an annual State of Motherhood report, which in this episode we discuss in depth and understand exactly what the current day climate is like for mothers, the challenges they have, and the things they are looking forward to. Previously, Kate was the co-founder and VP operations of iFund Women, where she drove millions of dollars into the hands of female founders. So without further ado, Kate, a big welcome to the show. All right, Kate, a big welcome to the podcast. You're Chief of Staff of Motherly. I want to hear about your kind of journey to there.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm so glad that we got connected. I'll give like a quick 90-second bio, but I graduated from college and I got a job in commercial real estate development at a great company. I loved working there, but it was a very male-dominated industry, and I felt a little bit lost in that. There were no women in leadership, and it was really hard to see like what an upward trajectory would look like. While I was there, I had my first child, my daughter Maggie, and then had to relocate because my husband was in medical school. But when I was figuring out what job I wanted to have next, I think as many mothers can attest to, you have a child and it really changes your vantage point of what you want out of a career and what you want out of your life. So I really wanted to be doing work that was exciting and that felt like it was inspiring. So I got a job at a company that was pegged as like YouTube without the trolls, but it was a video conversation platform for women. And I worked there for a couple of years. And from there, we transitioned it into a company called iFund Women, which was a startup funding marketplace for female entrepreneurs. So I got into this space of like entrepreneurship, helping women. And I loved it. I loved my job as like getting to talk to women all day and helping them solve their problems and helping them grow their businesses. In that role, I was at a conference a few years ago from Mother Honestly that was put on in Detroit, where the CEO of Motherly, Jill Koziel, was the keynote speaker. And she was talking about how at Motherly, they were declaring 2020 the year of the mother. Mind you, this was like October 2019, just to set the stage. And we're really going to ask for some significant change to help make the world a better place for mothers. I think we all know that 2020 was not that, sadly. But Jill and I met there and we had a really nice relationship. And then we just kept in touch over the years. I really admired the way Motherly was handling COVID and how they were communicating with their team about it and what their expectations were. And as an operator at iFund Women, I was kind of looking to Jill to see what she was doing, how she was like, rallying her team during this time. Fast forward a couple of years later, I left iFund Women. I was taking a little bit of a break and was just like talking to Jill on a catch-up call and telling her what I wanted to do next, which was I knew I wanted to do this chief of staff role, which is a little bit like a conductor of an orchestra, trying to get many different people to be rallied around like the same tune and be inspired. And the way I actually pitched it to her is I said, I think like a chief of staff, especially at a women-led company, is like a dad in some ways. It's like mom has this mission and vision and dad is like getting everyone on board with it and saying, this is what we're going to do, and rallying everybody and backing mom up. And that was my kind of like, cutesy way of creating it. But I knew I wanted to do something where I was like working on strategic projects and being like a second to the CEO, supportive to the CEO, but also not in that role. And Jill I remember like I was in my bedroom. She's like, that's what I need. That's exactly what I want. Her co-founder, Liz Kennedy, had just stepped down. She had 4 kids at that time. Now she has 5, and she wanted to spend a little bit more time at home. So Jill was kind of looking for that support person as well, and that person to be backup. So she asked me about it and I wasn't ready. I was going to take a longer time off in between jobs, but when she offered the position, I was really excited about it and I took it on. So I had a 2-week gap between jobs. So I was planning like a several month gap between jobs. I started at Motherly in January of 2022 and I've worked on a lot of things. But first, one of the biggest things that I've worked on that I'm excited to talk to you about is our State of Motherhood report. And this is something that Motherly does every year for the past 6 years. We just completed our 6th annual State of Motherhood report. And it's a way that we poll mothers in our audience. We have had anywhere from 10 to 20,000 women taking our poll, or mothers rather, taking our poll, and to really understand what's working in motherhood, what's not working, what needs to change. How do we rally behind that change? How do we take action and understand the current state of motherhood in the US? And it's something that we're really, really excited about. It's this great tentpole program that we have. And it's always like fascinating to see what the results are. Because you can know some of the stuff anecdotally, but until you actually see it on paper, you don't know how things are trending.
And I think what's so interesting as well is this is very much a surveyed study. And I think there's such value in that because you're actually getting kind of the real time data from people who are expressing exactly what is happening in their lives. And I think that's probably one of the most underused formats of gathering and sort of collecting data and sort of understanding what is going on. I'd love to just, could you give us, for anyone listening who maybe doesn't know, what is Motherly and what is important to Motherly?
Yeah. So Motherly was founded in 2015 by Jill Koziel and Liz Kennedy. It's the leading media platform for, at first it was millennial moms, but now it's all modern moms. Jill and Liz started Motherly because they wanted to create a platform for mothers that looked and felt like who they were, that was mom focused, not kid focused, that was positive and not scary, that was empowering, but also sharing the vulnerable parts of Motherly. When I tell people I work in Motherly, like immediately they say, "Oh, I follow you guys on Instagram." But that's really like our on Instagram or Facebook, that's really where people know us. But like a media platform, we are a website, we have a social presence. We also have a very robust podcast that Liz Kennedy, our co-founder, co-host, that's phenomenal about all different conversations on motherhood. But we really center everything around motherhood at Motherly. One of the things that I think is most important about Motherly that differentiates us from every other parenting platform is we take motherhood seriously. We don't think it's cute or funny or niche. We think that it's an important role. And just to go back for a second to the State of Motherhood report, something that many people have told me is nobody's asked me all these questions about this one enormous role that I have. Nobody's really wanted to know about that. I think so often women have to keep all of the labor and responsibilities and joys and pleasures of motherhood kind of a little bit secret, especially in the workplace. And I think it's really important to put those all front and center and to say, this is important work. This is exciting. This is tiring. This is joyful. It's many different things at once, but it's critically important for us to create content and representation that is woman focused and is taking motherhood seriously.
Mm, I love that. And talking of that, I'd love to hear, how was your journey of sort of returning to work after you'd had a child? How was that for you? And I think, were there any surprising or particularly challenging aspects that you maybe didn't predict, or anything that you thought might be difficult and then turned out actually was a lot easier than you'd imagined?
That's a great question. So I have 3 kids and they're all like 2 years apart. After my first was born, my husband and I had relocated and moved in with my parents, and I worked very part time. And that was really nice. I loved that period of time. And I actually think that laid the foundation for me being a really confident mom, as I had so much time with my daughter and in my parents' house. So my mom was around guiding me, and I planned to go back to work kind of right after. But since we relocated, I had this opportunity to stay home and work, around her nap time. And that was really such a dream. And then when my son was born, I started working more part to full time, not full time yet. And that was challenging. That was like, we really couldn't afford like good childcare, or we had a great nanny. We just couldn't really afford her. And it was really trying to like bridge that gap of the work that I was doing wasn't making that much money. My husband was in residency and I loved the work that I was doing, but I constantly felt pulled. And I think that's like very many moms. I see this very commonly, moms working from home, and they're doing this like nap time shuffle of you're trying to
Yeah.
work when your kid's napping or at night or on the weekends. And it works until it doesn't work. But I think it is really challenging for people that can't afford something else to really feel like you're doing both well. And so then my daughter was born, our last child, and she, at that point, then I was working full time before I had her. I was off for, I think, 12 weeks on maternity leave. And then when I returned to work, we had an au pair who came during that time, and that was phenomenal. And that was like the right childcare for us, was someone that was in the house, that was very hands-on, that was very helpful. And that allowed me to fully focus on work going back to work, but knowing that we had excellent care at home. And
Mm,
so I think that were there surprising things? I think it's surprising like how pulled you are in many different directions. I was fortunate that throughout the whole time of having little kids and working, I had my mom in my ear saying, "You can get through this. You can do this. It's not that long before they're in school." And when you're in it, you're like, "I don't know, it feels like a really long time."
mm.
But now we have three kids that are like 9, 7, and 5. They're in full day school, and our lives, at least during the day, have slowed down. Our lives after school have 10x'd in terms of
Yes.
activities. But I feel grateful because I think that is a time, and I understand this, that many women step away from the workforce because it's just like the numbers don't add up. It's really challenging. And I'm glad that I stuck through it because I've always loved working. I've loved making money. I've loved like growing in that way. And I feel grateful that I was able to stick it through, even though sometimes it was, really, really, really exhausting and challenging.
Yeah. And when you especially with your third child, when you went back to work, what did you find the biggest challenge was to actually go back? Was it just a time constraint? Was it exhaustion? What were the dynamics when you transitioned back?
I mean, a couple of things. With the third child, I felt like the exhaustion was huge. I think this is something very few people talk about in the workplace, and I understand why they don't, is I had real like mommy brain after each kid. Like during, I don't know the exact time, but maybe 6 months to 12 months where I couldn't remember anything. And with my third child, I remember saying to a coworker of mine, I was like, "You're the only person I'll confess this to." But I was like, "I can't remember anything." I was like, zero details I could remember. So I was writing like copious notes. Every call I was on, I was writing copious notes. Like just the littlest facts were in one ear and out the other. That was really challenging because it's you kind of have to like fake that you are remembering
Mm.
things. And I remember a couple of times like my husband was saying things to me and I just couldn't remember any specific details. So that was really hard. And the sleep thing was really hard. Like the being sleep deprived really just takes a toll on your body. I always think it's interesting when people will say things like, "I need a lot of sleep." I kind of think that's the equivalent of saying I need to eat food every day. Everybody needs a lot of sleep, or everyone needs adequate sleep, and our bodies really don't function well. So I changed my diet a lot after my third daughter was born to try to, I couldn't control like other things. I couldn't control how much sleep I was getting or how much I could exercise. But I changed my diet, which helped me have a lot more energy. And I felt like that was exactly what I needed at that period of time.
That's really interesting. And just talking about sort of diet, I've been really fascinated by this concept of, when you have a child, it's probably, and I don't have kids yet, so this is speculating. So feel
Yeah,
free to push back. It feels like it's one of the most out of control times in your life because you
exactly.
don't. There's so many variables you just can't control. What was how did you have a relationship with control, and was there any sort of particular lesson you learned about? So for example, what you've just said, you were able to control what you ate, and that somehow then maybe gives control to everything else. But I'd love to
Yeah.
sort of press on that. Is there any sort of feelings you have or thoughts you have?
I think I'm not a particularly controlling person. I'm a pretty flexible person. And I think one like benefit, it was like an advantage and a disadvantage that my husband had is we had kids like relatively young in if you live in an urban area. We had like our first daughter at 27, then 29, then 31. So really like none of my friends were having kids at that time. And because of that, we never really got into this like regimented schedule. This is what we always did. And then having a kid changed everything. My husband had been in medical school, so we kind of had no control of our schedule as a result of that. So we're really used to that. And so I think that the change of having kids didn't feel like a radical change because we had been used to things not being in control. I think that I'm not. I wouldn't say that I'm a controlling person, but I need a schedule and regiment in the day, and I think that makes for a happy life. So like our kids, we have kind of the same schedule every day. When our kids were little, I was like pretty maniacal about that they stayed on a schedule. I think that's critical for kids and parents to know that at this time they will be sleeping and at this time they do these things. Obviously, with all of those things, you want wiggle room on either end. But I think that that allows you to have things feel orderly in your life. And then the other thing that my husband and I are both like really excellent at is we always keep a really like neat house, that at the end of the day everything's cleaned up and everything's put away, because I think that helps you start every day with a fresh slate and not to just get too overwhelmed. And then I also think it's like always finding time to prioritize yourself, and that's easier said than done, but I think that for many people it doesn't come naturally. And like, you can't lose yourself completely in being a parent, because that's not going to benefit anyone, not your kids, not your spouse, like not your friends, nobody.
Completely. And it's actually maybe a perfect transition, because I saw there was a really interesting stat about self-care in the report as well.
Yes.
So I think first, before we dive into the sort of fascinating findings, when did this State of Motherhood report start, and what galvanized it?
Yeah. So this is our sixth annual. So it started 6 years ago. We've done it every single year. And we really wanted to understand who our mothers are and what they want. So we launched our first report 6 years ago. So whatever year that is.
Yeah.
And and I guess 2017. And we then used it as an opportunity to really get to know her, what she wants, what she needs, what's working, what's not working. And then we've continued it every single year. We add and subtract questions every year. We have a lot of kind of core questions that we always ask. But then we asked, like during COVID, we asked a lot more questions about that. We were really curious about how people were responding to that, how behaviors were changing. This year, we really eliminated all of the COVID questions, and we focused a lot more on what's trending or what's going to happen. So we asked a lot more financial questions, a lot more questions around like a recession, a lot more questions about just mom's mental health, mom's self-care, and things like that. So we change them a little bit every single year, but by and large, it's a lot of the same core questions.
Super interesting. And I'd love to maybe hand over to you in terms of what for this year, for 2023, what was the most surprising thing that came out of it for you?
So I think one of our first stats was that the rate of stay-at-home moms doubled from last year. So nearly 25% of our audience is stay-at-home moms, or respondents are stay-at-home moms, compared to 15% last year. That's a big change. And really the way we're thinking about that is like the great resignation is continuing for people. And it's a lot of different factors. It's really challenging to find childcare. So you can't work if you don't have childcare. Like it's very, very challenging to do that. And that's if you're lucky enough to work remotely, right? So many people need to go to a physical place and work, and you can't bring your kids to do that. I think the cost of everything, like the cost of things rising and going up, are making people like needing to just realign their priorities and stay home. I think that it's feeling not supported or burned out in the workplace. It's a lot of different things, but that one was really surprising. Eight in 10 women or moms are worried about a recession. Less surprising, but it shows that this is like top of mind. And 71% are planning to cut back on spending. If you think of who spends the most money, it's moms. Like moms are making all of the household decisions. So that's really worrisome, because I think what happens is before a recession is people start changing their spending habits, which almost then causes a recession to happen. So that's another stat that was like pretty alarming for us.
And just on that financial cutback, do you have any idea of where the cutbacks are going to be primarily? And is it your everyday, maybe buying less expensive groceries and sort of shortcuts, or is it, do you think, more of the big expenditures that are going to be cut?
Yeah, so 77% of women said entertainment and eating out. 65% said personal care or spending on self. 42% said vacation or travel. 40% said gifts. 31% said kids' toys, 26% said household, 10% said kids' activity. So first and foremost is like that discretionary spending, entertainment, eating out, personal care, but then followed by vacation, which is interesting. I think vacations have really been on the back burner these last few years with COVID and with borders being closed, etc. And now I think with the cost of everything going up with inflation and everything, I think that's making people really skittish.
That's so fascinating. And I also find what's really interesting in that is that the spending on the child seems to be still quite high, or at least not getting cut as much. Could you add some narrative behind, is that something you've seen consistently, where mums will typically not cut spending on their kids, but cut
Yeah.
spending. And I think self-care is the one that comes to mind. So what, 65% you said? That's sort of a large proportion that are willing to sacrifice themselves and
It's
not necessarily their
it's
child.
it's a trend that I've seen anecdotally for years, and I find it really troubling, is that parents who make the money will put themselves behind their kids always, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that many people want their kids to have a great life and they want to provide the things that they want. And in many ways, kids' needs can sometimes feel more immediate than adults. Adults can have some patience and understand that if they don't get something, it's not a big deal. But it is a little bit troubling to see that, you know, the economic times are changing. What are you going to cut? Moms. Anything that mom is spending on herself, we're going to cut. But we're going to still sign our kids up for all of these travel sports and put their needs first. And personally, I find that a little bit troubling. I think that so often, I think moms can be treated like second class citizens, like they're not important at all. And then I think that that can like breed resentment and regret and all of these things. And I think that probably the happiest moms are the ones that are consistently prioritizing themselves. And that does not mean, not doing things for your kids. It just means that it's like a balance, right? If you're cutting back on yourself, you're cutting back on the kids. Like that number, I would love to see that number like 50-50
Mm,
versus, kids' activities being cut 10%. And sometimes it's also like certain things are cheaper to do than others. So maybe if a mom wants to do something, it could cost more money than a kid's activity. So, but this is like a common trend that we see, that moms are not prioritizing themselves both financially with activities and things like that, but then with also spending time with friends and prioritizing their own alone time, which is unfortunate. And I think it's important to figure out where these pain points are so that moms can course correct, can say, I am happier when I see my friends, or I'm happier when I have sex, or I am happier when I exercise. So I need to make sure that I find time to do those things.
completely. And I think that the two really interesting lenses of looking when sort of moms or parents in general deprioritize themselves. I think the one thing is that we see this so often is that the state of mind of the parent is contagious and the child picks that up. And so if a mom, particularly in this case, is not prioritizing just basic self-care or just needing that alone time, it's going to have a sort of secondary ripple effect. And I think the other lens, which I think is really interesting, is this mimetic sort of modeling, where children are going to look up to their parents and see what are their parents doing and how do they treat themselves. And in a lot of what a child develops is actually about modeling from what they see from others. And so I'm interested sort of, what do you think, why do you think that this is the case? Do you think that mums are deprioritizing their self-care because they don't think it's as important? Or what is that underlying narrative do you think that they're telling
Yeah.
themselves?
I think first and foremost, like some of this is structural issues. It's that moms are pulled in so many different directions, don't have adequate, state sponsored childcare. And so I think that they're feeling like many of the responsibilities are falling on them. And I think that when you feel so stressed all of the time, it's hard to do anything at the end of the day besides just like wanting to get in bed and sleep. So in no way do I want to blame mothers for any of this. But I think that the stories that we tell ourselves and that we see represented in the media, on social media as well, are these stories of moms that are like, kind of this martyr character, and they're doing everything for their kids. And we don't see those same stories for dads. I was speaking to my husband the other day. I go in phases of just deleting Instagram from my phone. And he was saying, like, why? He doesn't understand it because all he sees on Instagram is workout videos and fishing videos, right? So you can see like what he's being targeted for. And I was like, all I see is like moms with so much plastic surgery creating these like custom made meals for their kids. It's this very much like idyllic household experience that is triggering, that doesn't exist for dads. There's not that
Mm,
same thing of I'm a dad and I'm doing all these things for my kids and look what I made them for dinner and I'm driving them to all these activities and I made this like perfect birthday celebration for them. I haven't seen that on Instagram. I think that we put all of these pressures on mom, that it's just more and more and more and more and more. So create these like awesome birthday celebrations for your kids. For me, like that's not super fun for me to do. So I don't do it. Like our kids have had one birthday party in all of our family life, and that is adequate. That's just not something that I feel like is essential. And I think that there are other ways to celebrate. So I think it's over time, everything has become additive in our society. And who is responsible for all of that stuff is moms. And I think they don't feel like they can take the time. And I loved what you said before about modeling this behavior, because it's something my husband and I've been like pretty maniacal about. Is it's funny, when our kids were little and we would go out, the kids had no problem. Like they didn't ever kind of comment on it. And as they've gotten older, sometimes, especially our oldest daughter will say, I don't want you guys to go out or I'll miss you. And I always say it's important for mom and dad to have time by themselves, like away from you kids, because we have a relationship that's separate and distinct from you guys. Or this weekend, I'm going to Chicago with friends from elementary school. And I think it's important for my kids to see me as having a life that's not with them, or having a role separate from them, right? Sometimes it can put a lot of pressure on kids if it feels like the only role that I have is their mom. That's it. I'm not a daughter, I'm not a sister, I'm not a friend, I'm not a wife. And I think it's important for them to see you taking on those different roles, because I think that creates independence. And the goal, at least my goal for raising kids, is for the kids to be independent from me and my husband. That's like the path we're leading them towards. And I think a way to model it is to show them that they are independent, that it's not just mom and dad that can put them to bed, or if I'm gone for a weekend, like that's not a problem.
And it doesn't mean you don't love them. It doesn't mean you're not there for them. It
Yeah,
just means
yeah.
that you've got a life. And
And it also means like, oh, go on.
Sorry, go. No, I'm going
Oh,
to you go for it.
I was going to say, it also means like something we've really wanted to foster is that a lot of people can love them and take good care of them. We've had 2 au pairs now, and I think we've shown them through that. Like there are a lot of people that are trustworthy, and a lot of people that are going to love our children. And I think that's a really beneficial thing for kids to learn, that it's not just mom and dad, that there are a lot of people in that space.
And talk me through when you kind of started to model that and explain to what your kids about, you needing your own time and separate lives. How did you find that experience went, and how did they sort of take it? And what have the results been?
I think that kids are adaptable. And I think that especially as they get older, they need a little bit more explanation. Like, you're not just going to say, mom and dad are going out, like, shut up, goodbye. It's important, I think, to say we're going out and we're having fun. And that's a great thing. And they get to have fun with a babysitter, too. That's a great thing for them. And I think that they also see that we're happier as a result of that. Like, I am a big believer of if parents have a happy marriage, it will be a happy household for kids to grow up in. And that filters down to everybody. I think that, like, when things are acrimonious at home and you don't spend time with your partner doing things that you enjoy, like it does filter down in the kids. So you're not always on the same page. And there's a lot to be said for just going out and having fun. And then the next morning, you're kind of like, you're rejuvenated. You feel like excited to be around your kids and not kind of worn out by them. And I think that that's a really positive thing. And I think it's important for my husband and I have really tried, as the kids have gotten older, to explain things to the kids. So we'll try to work out on the weekends in the morning and say, we'll do whatever you guys want to do for the rest of the day, but mom and dad want to work out in the morning, because that's important for our bodies to do that. And and we've always said, like, when you're parents, you'll understand. But I think that just explaining like why it's important, but then saying, but the rest of the day, we'll do whatever you guys want. We're just starting the day off focused on us right now.
Yeah, that's awesome. And are there any, I'm super interested because you've got a very interesting vantage point working for Motherly and seeing the data that you do and being immersed in this conversation. Is there what are the trends you've seen that maybe have influenced you over the years in terms of how you approach parenthood or marriage or being a working mom?
I think that the trends just keep going in this really negative way. And what I glean from some of that is I actually feel like quite happy where I feel like I stand in response to the data. Like it really is so uncommon that moms are trying to prioritize themselves or spending time with their friends or going out with their partner. And a lot of those things are also, what financially you're able to do or what support systems you have. Do you have family that lives nearby? Do you have someone that can watch your kids? Do you have a kid that is easy enough to be watched, right? That's not all kids. But the data just keeps kind of getting more and more dire. And I feel just personally, this kind of like internal compass, and maybe it's just being contrarian, but to say, I don't want that to be my story. I don't want my story to be like, I'm worn out all of the time and I can't take care of myself. And I also believe as moms, we owe it to our kids to take care of ourselves, like to prioritize our health, our mental health, our well-being. And that's not always so easy to do. And what I know to be true is like no one is doing it for you. So no one is going to come and say, "Hey Kate, like it seems like now would be a great time for you to work out. Why don't you go do that right now?" The only person that does that is like my sister-in-law when we spend time together. But I think that you need to be able to be selfish and say, if this might not be a great time right now, but I'm going to go work out and I'll be way happier when I come back. Or I'm
Mm.
going to make these kind of like choices to prioritize myself, and that will pay off in spades. And I know, like, for example, seeing my girlfriends this weekend, like that, the tail of that kind of time together is so long. The like excitement and the joy, and just, it's like also just fun to be with your friends and just like, get drunk and giggle and be silly and be removed from being a mom and just be like, feel like you're in high school again. I think that's like very critically important. And I think those finding times to prioritize that stuff is like it's really a huge thing. And I'm really grateful that I've always done that, and that's something that our family has prioritized, is making time for that.
I also think it's such an important story for mums to hear because I think a lot of the time, as you said, there's so much social pressure on mums to act a certain way, to be a certain way, to feed their children a certain type of
Yeah.
food, to have the
Yeah.
kind of birthday parties, and actually to see other mums role modeling, kind of taking back that power a little bit and saying, "Hey, listen,
Yeah.
I I can't give you your oxygen mask unless I've got my own on, and I need to give
Yeah.
myself some oxygen right now." I think it's such an important story, and I think thank you for kind of sharing that because it is. I'm sort of very big into the idea of role modeling thing, or role models being a very important piece of kind of giving people tacit permission to say, "Hey, it's okay to say to your
Yep.
husband next time, listen, sweetheart, I'm going away for the weekend. You're going to deal with the kids. That's just how it's going to need to be
Yeah.
because, you've been on golf tours for the last four weekends." And I think that it seems that from the data as well, mums take the majority of the care load. And I'd love, maybe could you kind of give some color on from the report this year, how much of the sort of childcare burden was typically our mums taking on?
Yeah. So one of the questions we ask that I always think is fascinating is, how do you split up responsibilities in your household? Is it only you, mostly your partner, or do you share equally? And we ask a ton of questions. Like, I'll just kind of read some of the things we ask: scheduling medical appointments, family scheduling, household errands, planning children's activities, household cleaning, meal planning and preparation, planning social calendar or date nights, grocery shopping, coordinating childcare, bedtime routines, children's drop off and pickup, paying bills, children's schoolwork, financial planning, pet care. I've read them all out loud because I think it's important to see, like, that's a lot of stuff. That requires so much work. And sadly, it's like moms are primarily responsible for most of those tasks. So you think about, you have a job or you're taking care of kids all day long, and then you have this whole other job. Like that is a job description in and of itself. And
Mm.
that so much of the burden is falling on moms. What I hope with this data is that moms take a look at this and they follow perhaps what Eve Rodsky has been a big proponent of, and she wrote the book Fair Play, which is you take all of the tasks that you have to do in your household and you and your husband divide them up. And I'm a big believer too of someone fully owning a task, not partially owning it and not getting another person involved in it, like fully owning a task. And so you're not thinking about everything. And one thing, I guess, to go back to a question you asked earlier, is what surprised you about having kids? The amount of operational excellence, or just operations, that it takes to run a household. Like that is, it's something my husband and I think are really, really strong at, but it is a lot of work. Like every week we kind of look at our calendar. Who's driving who to what activity? What are we eating for meals? What are we, like, what doctor's appointments do we have? What bills do we have to pay? Like it's all of this different work. It's a lot of work. And I think like it, until you're in it, you really can't imagine like how much time you spend doing it. It's impossible for one person to do it. It's too much responsibility for one person to do. I think perhaps maybe a little bit easier if you have kids that are elementary school age, like an in school all day. It's like too challenging to probably do when you have a toddler and a baby at home. But it's a tremendous amount of work to run a household, and I think that it's also like important work, and I think that it's important that we like acknowledge that. One of the stats that we talked about earlier is the number of women leaving the workforce to stay at home, and while that can be viewed as a negative thing, right? Women stepping back from advances, it can also be a really positive thing. Like my mom stayed at home when I was young. That was a really positive experience. I had a great time. Like she loved staying at home. She was very happy. Our household, like I had really nice birthday parties and packed lunch every day, which my kids do not have, but they're really lovely experiences about it. So I do try to take a look at both things as like they can be positive and negative. That while that can seem not a great stat, it can also be positive if people are really happy with the decisions that they're making there.
Completely. And one thing I always kind of, in that decision, I think if it's a choice, that's wonderful, but it needs to be a choice. And do you have any of the data around how many women are actively choosing to be stay-at-home mums because they are looking for kind of the benefits of it? Or is it more of a forced decision based on financial reasons or just not being able to juggle everything? Because I think there's two very different motivations, and being able to make that choice from a place of strength is an amazing choice to make. I'm fully with you. But my suspicion, unfortunately, is that probably women feel like they have to make that choice, which I think then has a whole host of other potential feelings and sort of consequences that can come up as a result if you feel like you're being kind of forced out of a job. I don't
Yeah.
know the stats though. I'd love do you have any color on what sort of the real state of play is?
Well, what's super interesting, and I'll have more to report later, but what we've always done with the State of Motherhood report is ask the questions, and then we've reached back out to the people who've taken the survey to say, can you provide color commentary? So we're hearing from people and their unique experiences. And so we actually just got a lot of those responses recently. One person was saying she left at the end of her maternity leave because there weren't childcare options for her child. And a lot of people live in childcare deserts where there's no daycare or no daycare with available spaces, and you can't afford a nanny. So it kind of eliminates like what you can do. Other people said that they're burned out. Their career wasn't really giving back to them and they wanted like a values aligned career. Someone else said like they couldn't go back to a workplace full time to an in office, that just really changed their life. And I think for so many people, it really did shift during COVID. Once you take away a commute, then when you add it back in, it feels additive instead of it always used to be there, right? I think the same thing, like that has happened with like student loan payments being on hold. It's really hard to add something back in when it was on hold. Another person said like the pay was inadequate for what they were doing and that it was hardly covering the cost of childcare and housekeeping expenses. I think a lot of people talk about like their spouses making a lot more than them in making the decision. And again, like childcare and housekeeping expenses. The one thing like I sometimes wish would happen more is people would look at household salary versus individual person salary. So I think like a very, very common equation is I make 50,000, my spouse makes 100, childcare and housekeeping expenses are 50,000, so I should step away from the workplace, right? But I think a better equation, and this like a friend had shared this with me, is your household makes 150,000. So how childcare and household expenses for your family and your children is a third of that. It's not 100% of your salary, it's a third of that. And I wish more people would look at things that way because it is I don't love the idea that it's like just covering one person's salary. It's the wrong calculation to do. And it's also I think a little bit inaccurate because you're not always going to be making 50,000. If you think of a career and you're 30 or 35, you're not always going to be making 50,000, and assuming you send your kids to public school, your childcare costs will go down to some degree, and then they'll probably go back up with college and things like that. But I think people look at that and it's a very short term view. I also think it's really hard to go back to work after you have kids. I think it's like many things shift so seismically in a woman, and it's hard to go back. Like I think that is for a lot of people. It's like they also just want to stay home. If they didn't want to, they probably wouldn't. And I think that is like something else. I'll just read another one. Someone said, since COVID, I'm prioritizing more than ever the well-being of our family as a whole. children are not a burden or an obstacle, but a blessing and the most rewarding work we'll ever have. Like, I love that response.
Mm,
That's, it shows
yeah.
that pull to be doing that. And I think that financial things are not excuses, but sometimes I think it's like you also want to stay home. Like that, there is a
Yeah.
reason that people are choosing to do this and that they want to do it.
I do think that I think that's your friend who gave that sort of framework. I think that's super powerful because it just opens the conversation in a bit more of an equal footing. Sort of, it's not just, oh, well, it's my salary, I may as well stay home, assuming that sort of the father is earning more. If not, it doesn't apply, but it actually does apply on both sides. I think it's just a really useful frame as a unit. This is what our constraints are. Now,
Yeah.
there's multiple options we can do. There's multiple things. What is the best choice? And I think it also probably opens up an avenue for creativity. It's okay. What about if I do part time, or what if we both do part time? There's more
Yeah.
possibilities within that framework. So I really like that. I think maybe the last sort of theme I'd like to touch on that I was really I think saddened by to see in the report was the mental health of mothers. And sort of,
Yeah.
could you give some more color on what you're seeing and sort of the trends that we're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that moms are completely burnt out from 2 years of COVID. And I think like this year was also really challenging for a lot of parents of kids being sick nonstop this year. I think we basically went like right from COVID, had a small period break, and then into like fears of a recession and the starts of a recession and lots of layoffs. And I think that it's a really challenging period of time for moms. I think there's this huge demand on their time, on their free time, and I think all of these things are like linked together. Many people have conditions and they need to see a therapist, and that really helps them with what's going on, but I think that there's no doubt that moms are way more anxious. For example, we live in a country that doesn't protect children at schools. I think that it's really hard not to be anxious in that. We've gotten so much information, misinformation, confusing information about COVID. I think that schools, I know from many people, have been really challenging this full year back of COVID. Anecdotally, I think many people would describe it as like a mess across many different schools. So I think that there are a lot of kind of challenges for moms, and I think that when you don't feel balanced in your life, I think that really messes with your head. And I think not having time to yourself, not having enough time to exercise, not like being able to see your friends or spend time and do these things that I think create joy, then the opposite of joy is like dissatisfaction and kind of feeling this like general malaise. And I know from all of my friends, myself included, like everyone's had that this past year and the past few years before. Like it's very hard not to have that.
Completely. And then maybe to end on a positive note, if assuming you do another 2024
We will.
report,
Yeah.
what would you hope to see? And where do you think there is actually real scope for moving the needle in the right direction in terms
Yeah.
of the data that we're seeing?
I would love to see some more positive notes. So one of the positive stats is moms were reporting to getting an hour additional of sleep a year. So I would love to see more positive changes. I would love to see moms having more time with their partner, having more than an hour free time a day. I would love to see moms exercising more. I would love to see moms having less household responsibilities, like more fun, less not fun. And shift change doesn't happen overnight. It's not you're not, you never have spent a night away from your kid and now you're going to go out 3 times a week with your husband and plan several trips away from your kids. That's not how it's going to work, but maybe it's one trip away, and maybe it's getting one babysitter once a month or once a quarter or something. I'd love to see an increase in moms having sex more often. We asked a question of how often do you want to have sex and how often are you having it? And mom said like once a week, but they're not doing that. So I'd love that more because I think people are happier when they have sex. I think that I would love to just see mom prioritizing herself a little bit more. And in my like perfect reality, moms would look at this survey and would say, I need to do better. I want to change this and I want to fight and advocate for change. Or I would love to see moms saying, who are these moms that are prioritizing this stuff? I want to be in that category. That's the hope, is that the data improves lives for moms and helps them to prioritize themselves more and focus on their own health and well-being.
Awesome. Thank you, Kate. And thank you also for, I think, really leading by example, because it's your sort of to hear a story like this from a mom who maybe isn't feeling able to put herself first. I think it's a super inspiring sort of narrative to hear, and just to see what is possible, and sort of maybe challenge some of the perceptions of needing to take everything on, and maybe filling that role of the martyr that sort of gets sort of lambasted all over social media.
Yeah,
So thank you so much. It's been a super interesting and insightful conversation, and I think what Motherly is doing with this report is just fantastic, and being able to then share that data more broadly is so useful. And I share and echo your hopes that sort of it galvanizes people in the right direction going forwards.
perfect. Well, I'm so glad to be here and to talk about this. And thank you so much for helping to further give a megaphone to our results and to motherhood in general. I so appreciate that.